So we're going to jump right into part 2 of Woodrow Wilson's presidency with October of 1916, when the first birth control clinic was opened in New York. The following month, Woodrow Wilson is reelected, and he did so on this slogan, which is kind of funny considering what's about to happen. As you can see, he ran off the idea of peace and prosperity. So that's going to be interesting here shortly. Before the end of the year, Wilson goes out of his way to try and mediate the war going on, and he sends peace notes to all the warring entities. In an effort to avoid a second war, he's encouraging these people to accept peace without victory. At the same time, he removes the general who's traipsing across Mexico. On the last day of January 1917, Germany goes back on its word that it gave after the whole Sussex incident and decides to start destroying ships again. And that was when the U.S. had it. We basically said, we're not talking to you anymore. And if you remember in the last video, I talked about how after decades, Congress kept trying to pass a bill that would keep illiterate immigrants from coming to the United States. And every time it's happened, the sitting president has always vetoed it, as did Wilson recently. But for the first time, Congress has overridden his veto, and now it's illegal for illiterate immigrants to come. It should be noted that it was gearing towards Asian laborers. 3 weeks later, the U.S. ambassador to Great Britain is handed a decoded message. It's called the Zimmerman Telegram, and in it, the ambassador to Mexico and the German foreign minister are trying to create an alliance. And in this alliance, they would be, for Mexican support to Germany during the war, they would return land that the U.S. took from Mexico. So there was some incentive. In March, during Wilson's second inauguration, he stands by his stance of neutrality in regard to the war going on in Europe. However, he sees the writing on the wall, as most people do. It's kind of inevitable at this point. So he says, the tragic events of the 30 months of vital turmoil through which we have just passed have made us citizens of the world. There can be no turning back. Our own fortunes as a nation are involved, whether we would have it so or not. So essentially, it's going to happen whether we want it to or not. So get ready. Less than a month later, Wilson asks Congress for a declaration of war. Days later, Wilson puts together the Committee on Public Information, which puts together the propaganda and censorship throughout the war. Before the end of April, the Liberty Loan Drive kicks in. As you can see here, Wilson signs a bill to sell $3 billion of debt at a 3.5% interest rate to the public to raise money. On May 18th, the Selective Service Act goes into effect, and all men 21 to 30 are required to register because they want you. This is the first time the federal draft lottery has been enacted since the Civil War. A month later, the Espionage Act is approved, and essentially it keeps anyone from saying anything negative about the military or the government. That could lead you to 10 years in prison or a fine of $10,000, which today would be about $270,000. The first set of American troops touched down in France on June 26th. In November, the 42nd Rainbow Division shows up. You can see them here with their flag that says Rainbow. And they're called that because there's one person from every state in the Union that's in this division. And Douglas MacArthur says, the 42nd Division stretches like a rainbow from one end of America to the other. And just before Christmas, the 18th Amendment is added to the Constitution, which prohibits the sale of, the distribution of, and the making of alcohol. Welcome to Prohibition. And in the first federally regulated dry January, Wilson has a speech that is aimed towards how he believes everlasting peace is going to happen. And in it, he focuses on 14 points. And if you want to read them, I will give you a moment here to check them out. We will hear about these again later. On January 26, 1918, Herbert Hoover, a name we'll hear again, was looking ahead. He was thinking about our resources and decided to enact food conservation, which would essentially have Americans have 1 day a week that was meatless, 2 days a week that was porkless, and 2 days a week that was wheatless. By spring, Congress gives power to the Post Office in the Sedation Act, which is an add-on to the Espionage Act. It gives the postmaster the ability to ban certain articles and magazines from being published or being distributed if it says anything negative about the government or the military. In September, presidential candidate Eugene Debs was arrested in Ohio after giving an anti-war speech, and he was given 10 years in prison under the Espionage Act. And it wasn't enough that we were fighting a war in Europe. We were also fighting an invisible enemy here and around the world in the name of the Spanish flu, where more people died getting the Spanish flu than they fought in the war. 600,000 people in the U.S. died from the Spanish flu and about 20 million worldwide. And Germany was so busy fighting a war with everyone that they forgot to check in back home. So revolution broke out in November, and Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicates the throne. 2 days later, the new German government reaches out to Wilson, and they're like, let's talk about this. We heard your 14 points. Let's end this. And so then it's announced that the Paris Peace Conference is happening, and Wilson is, of course, going. And he gets a very warm reception in both Rome and Paris. On Valentine's Day in 1919, Wilson writes up the League of Nations concept for a speech during the peace conference. That concept will be what eventually turns into the United Nations. And thanks to the support of the president, women get the right to vote from the 19th Amendment on the 19th of May. The treaty at Versailles takes place on July 10th. And you can see here in the Hall of Mirrors at the actual palace at Versailles. And it pretty much marks the end of the Great War. But what we don't talk about enough is how this treaty sets up the stage for the World War II coming up. But anyway, they talk more when Wilson brings this back to the U.S. to approve. They talk about it longer than they talked about it here in Versailles. And it didn't get approved. And there was only one other country involved that didn't approve the Treaty of Versailles, and that was China. In total, the United States loses 116,516 lives in the Great War. And the global count, its estimates are as high as 40 million. While Wilson was on tour across the U.S. trying to get support for the approval of the Treaty of Versailles, he has a stroke, and that stroke pretty much incapacitates him for the remainder of his presidency. His wife, Edith, is more or less the president acting from here on out. It paralyzes his left side, it impairs his speech. It's a pretty bad situation. In May, Congress works out their own treaty with Germany, which got approved, but Wilson vetoes it. While the party did not win re-election, Wilson himself won the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts in the war. So join us next time for yet another presidential tenure cut short.